So this is my my first image, just a title image. So as Dorothy said, I am writing a global history of Eastern Eurasia between the 7th and the 14th century, and I'm doing it without using the word China. And this is part of an ongoing critique in my work of standard categories. The problem of which, it seems to me, the problem of these standard categories is that they are all enmeshed in modernity, and that is particularly so of the concept of the nation and the nation state. And my particular attention has been turned to that more recently, not least because of incidents.
Naomi, I wonder if you could turn up the volume a little bit.
Okay. Maybe I should just sit closer to my screen. Let's try that. Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm particularly concerned with these categories enmeshed in modernity and with nation state, not least because of what Deborah was saying about the alt-right and the general, the more general attempt to associate of nationalism to claim medieval periods, pre-modern periods, as it were, for their own. So today I'm testing the approach, my approach through technologies, the approach I've adopted more recently. I'm doing that by looking at bodies and textiles that covered them and that mediated the most intimate and crucial of relationships. Now, this is a synthetic work. The thing I'm writing at the moment is a synthetic work, and different parts of this audience are likely to find different chunks of what follows familiar, but I know also that this is going out to medievalists more generally, and so some of this stuff will be very unfamiliar to them. My purpose today is to suggest some advantages to reassembling these pieces, however familiar, in a different way for wider historical audiences and with an eye to the world beyond academia. So the problem that we have, one of the many problems, is that history of all kinds, and not least medieval history, suffers from the problem of what's been called methodological nationalism, that typically takes the modern nation states or their putative precursors as the frame of analysis. With this audience, I think I can do this part fairly quickly, this part of my talk fairly quickly. We have the problem with China, of China as nation, and here we see the PRC map showing very clearly the conception of China as the current Chinese government would like us to see it, not only now, but since time immemorial. And the problem with this model is, like all nationalist models, it tends to present a quasi-national sinocentric model of pre-modern history, where the pre-modern Chinese dynasties lead inexorably to this modern nation state of China that we see here, which of course does not map on to the kind of pre-modern fluidity that I'm going to show you in that side, that red box. Here we have a map, as you can see, from 1002, showing a rather different political pattern. Not only does the modern conception of China, in scare quotes, not map onto this kind of pre-modern political fluidity, it also leaves out other places in Eastern Eurasia. It's very easy, it would be very easy to write the history that I'm currently writing of Eastern Eurasia, to write it as China with bits tacked on around the edges, which I'm deliberately trying not to do. So it seems to me that global history offers some opportunities, some useful ways out of this problem because global history, at least in my understanding of it, seeks connections and patterns in any and all aspects of human life and society. Global history approaches encourage the stepping outside the monoliths of state or of civilization, and attention to different scales of analysis, from overview to localities or even individuals, and the connections across different scales. And global history especially allows us to keep more of our attention on the local and the specific, the everyday and the anonymous, and to make them the centre or the focus of our analysis. So I'm approaching Eastern Eurasia in this global way with the addition of this formal restriction of not using the word China. We don't do formal restrictions very often. I know there's some lit people here who may be a bit more familiar with that concept, but historians don't do it very often. But in this instance, I found it very useful because it forces a rethink of what we call things, periods, regions, groups, amongst other things. And that in turn demands attention to what we really mean when we talk about these things. And it seems to me that historians don't do this often enough. So if we're thinking about groups, it's too easy, much too easy, to talk about the Chinese or the Koreans. But of course, these refer to modern states and the people they claim. Instead, I try to use the names of political units, and we can see here just a few, not necessarily coterminous with, not necessarily happening at the same time as each other. Liao, my old guys, the Liao, the Song, the Uyghur Khaganate, Kocho, etc. These are useful, it seems to me, because when you talk about political units, political entities, they are more bounded in time and space. They have starts and ends, they have expansions and contractions. And once you start thinking in that way, that opens questions about how these entities were structured and who was included in them. If we think about regions, I don't talk about Japan, but about the Japanese archipelago, or more locally, the Kinai region or Kyushu. Likewise, I talk about the Korean Peninsula. Once you've identified islands and a peninsula in this way, that gives us a mainland that we can talk about in contrast, and a mainland that has many regions, some of which are marked on the map, of different sizes for different purposes, the Tarim Basin, Mongolia, Lingnan, and so on and so forth. And thirdly, periods. So what you've got here is a chart of dynasties with dates, but my point is that I try not to use the names of dynasties. As you can see from this chart, they just don't line up with each other. So if you're talking about the whole of Eastern Eurasia, which one would you pick? Why privilege one over the other? And also, how do you line them up when they don't line up? But centuries are much more practical, they're neutral, they're more precise, and they get around the problem of when you say the Tang dynasty, you're talking about 300 years, and a lot can happen can and did happen in that time. But I have to say that getting out of the habit of referring to dynasties for those of us trained in this region is perhaps the hardest of the habits to break. So if we try and break those habits and use these different ways of thinking, that gives us more focus, it gives us more precision, and it also gives us a more human scale and the possibility of questioning and always thinking about what's inside the boxes. And that makes it easier to remember the local, which keeps reminding us to keep relating the global back to that local. So if I can't use the usual building blocks of ethno-political territorial units, then I need some other structuring concept. And my answer for this project is technologies, broadly understood. The concern, this is a picture of my colleague Kevin Green, from when I was at Newcastle, who taught me a great deal about technologies over lunch on a regular basis in the common room, which is a reminder of the importance of leaving your desk and going and eating lunch somewhere else. So these conversations with Kevin led me towards thinking about technologies, but the concern is not so much with specific technologies, such as weaving silk brocade, than with sets of practices that solve particular problems, such as how to meet clothing needs, or indeed how to convey religious ideas, get an heir, train an effective bureaucracy, and so on and so forth. And it's these sets of practices that constitute technologies in this usage, and some of you will recognize that definition from Francesca Bray's work. And this is an outline of my project. It's important to think about technologies in this way because it makes technologies very much about agency. People don't adopt things just because they're there or because they're the best way of doing something. They need reasons to change from what they already do. So here today I'm drawing from the section of this project on technologies of the body, which focuses on textiles. One further issue here, if I'm going to avoid merely writing descriptions of things people did, then I must reassemble my discussion of technologies into some kind of larger pattern. Having rejected ethnopolitical blocks, I have opted instead for layers that allow us to pursue specific technologies wherever they may be found, without regard for extraneous barriers or feeling required to try to account for the whole of a predetermined space. So just to tell you something about what these words mean, a relatively small number of technologies become embedded as practices that undergird the everyday life of all or virtually all the people in all social strata in a given region, such that, but the region is not predetermined, it's defined by the substrate, such that removal or abandonment of those practices would fundamentally alter the substance of life in those areas. So I call these technologies substrates, and we may think of other everyday practices as being rooted in them. So Mahayana Buddhism, for example, was by 600 a substrate across the whole of Eastern Eurasia, making indelible impacts on beliefs and everyday practices. Its absence would have made this region a very different place. The geographical range of other substrates, such as the use of silk textiles, was not coterminous with the extent of Buddhism or of anything else. The limits attained by each technology cannot be presumed to align, but must be traced separately. Technologies may occur in specific locations that form nodes, the second of these concepts, including examples such as shipyards, ports, or production centres. Nodes overlay the broader substrate and are usually places where a number of different layers interact with greater intensity. Those layers may also include networks of technologies, the top term on my pile here, and these networks usually, but not always, link nodes. There are lots of different networks, each forming its own layer. The three types of layer coexist and interact. The pattern for each technology will change over time. If we imagine a set of layers, then the connections between different technologies are made by looking down vertically, where the everyday life of a family, for example, is shaped by the ever-shifting relationships within the household, the coming and going of members, links into external networks or institutions, flows of wealth, changes in status, and by many other things too. So in its concern for interlocking specificities, this is fundamentally a micro-historical approach involving case studies of specific technologies, which staves off overgeneralization and mostly does not seek narrative arcs. This may lead to a weak sense of change over time, although that does emerge in places. Instead, the focus is on a selection of longer or shorter historical moments, lacking the overall story expected from a historian, and more like the practice of archaeologists, offering pieces towards an always incomplete and ever-evolving jigsaw. So today, we're going to test out how this might work for technologies of the body, approached through the topic of textiles. So let's think about textiles. Textiles as things that cover or uncover bodies, and as perhaps the most essential and versatile of human manufactures, provide threads from clothing to marriage, status, wealth and dowry, gender, sexual behaviour, childbirth, production, taxation, and politics. The key textile of Eastern Eurasia was silk, overwhelmingly produced in the mainland in this period and transported for use everywhere else. Here I focus on the socio-political uses of silk by the hyper-elite aristocracy of the Heian court of the 8th to 12th centuries, which you can see on the right, and the socio-economic roles of a range of textiles in primarily the cities of the lower and middle Yangtze regions in the 10th to 14th centuries, with some emphasis on the Shadafu literati elite. This selection of cases identifies networks of relationships mediated by textiles that were deployed in distinctive ways by different, mostly elite groups for the same purposes of pursuing and differentiating socio-political status or for controlling women. Silk fabrics formed a substrate underpinning those at the highest levels of these Eastern Eurasian societies. But while the purposes and materials were similar, the outcomes were diverse. And although I won't have time to discuss this today, we can identify that a silk substrate also lay beneath other social groups beyond the elites to different degrees, including not at all, and in different ways, depending on location and date. So let's start with the Heian court. Our knowledge of Heian social practices is limited by the strong skew of the evidence base towards fictional literature or self-conscious diaries like Genji Monogatari, The Tale of Genji, or Makuro no Shoshi, Sei Shonagan's Pillow Book, which focus entirely on a very small class comprising the imperial family and the highest aristocracy, and the minutiae of their lives in the mansions and palaces of the capital at Kyoto in the Kinai region. Conversely, in the problems with those sources, conversely, the advantage of the sources is that dress is the topic for nearly half of the Pillow Book, for example, and the obsession of such works with fine silk clothing and its significance in manifold areas allows us unusual insight into intimate lives of individuals, albeit only for this tiny group. We have the fullest accounts of dress, including innerwear, for the Heian aristocracy of the 11th to 12th centuries. At this time, both sexes wore red undertrousers, with scarlet reserved for married women, and a dark purple-red for girls, in slightly stiff, unglossed silk for everyday use, and glossed silk for special occasions. Men added puffed white trousers, and women a white chemise with no fastening, leaving their trousers and breasts visible where their gowns parted at the front, though not in this modest modern reconstruction. That's the first image, I think, is intended to be these first layers. Aristocratic women famously wore over these undergarments several layers of unbelted robes, each stitched slightly smaller at the edges than the one below. The goal was to show off at neckline, cuff, and hem the skill and artistry of the wearer in producing her own tasteful and original take on the colour combinations specified for the current season, of which there were over 200. By the early 11th century, such display could extend over 20 layers until sumptuary laws restricted the basic set to 5, as you can see here, for wear in women's own quarters, with additional layers permitted for going out or formal occasions. The lightest silks were the gauzes and crepes with open weaves, followed by twills and damasks, then brocades with or without gold and silver thread, and finally taffetas. It is difficult to overestimate the importance of colour in the Heian aristocratic dress code, which as a system exercised minute control over the everyday lives of courtiers, while at the same time providing an avenue for individual expression within this group. The nobility recognised extraordinarily fine gradations of shade and tone which marked rank, status, gender and taste, so that, for example, several shades of red and deep purple could be worn only by imperial women. For men, rank was marked by specific colours, and higher rank was marked by deeper shades because these required multiple dyeings using costly materials. Certain weaves and patterns were also restricted to specified ranks and categories at court. Granting special permission to individuals to wear colours or fabrics above their station was a form of exemption that created complex relationships between donor and recipient. Much attention has been paid to the artistry displayed by court women exercising the tiny amount of agency left to them by the plethora of clothing rules. Colours had to be changed each season, of which one calendar listed 72 of just a few days each. Colour changes alluded deeply to the life cycles of specific plants, and the most fashionable changed their robes slightly in advance of the relevant blooms, requiring close attention and fine judgment. Within the seasonal parameters and emphasising appropriateness over originality, each woman could combine colours as she chose, as we see in a passage from the Tale of Genji. Here we go. Lady Nezame wore an outer garment of the cherry combination, pale on the outside with a deep hued lining, but did not use ordinarily expected colours to go with it. She donned underneath a single layer robe of the birch cherry combination with an appropriately deep shade matched with pale blue. Still underneath was a mixture of deep and pale blue with a layer in between of the blossoming cherry combination of rich pink lined with nicely pale pink. She seemed as if to wear colours perfectly gradating from the deeper to the paler. All of this was complemented by perfumes and created effects approaching that of music. Women felt judged for every aspect of their appearance. Failure to match aesthetic trends with requisite taste could incur criticism or mockery, which ensured a social conformity that maintained the boundary between the aristocracy and everyone else. Even inside their own quarters, women sought to present a stately bearing, a full face with a high forehead, white skin, shaved eyebrows repainted higher up, and thick, shining black hair down to the floor. Men and women alike painted and powdered their faces and stained their teeth black, but women were expected to look beautiful like this at all times and suffered deep embarrassment or even shame if caught on first awakening or after crying. Aristocratic brides brought property into the marriage, land, house, textiles, that she controlled to support her and her children, and frequently also the groom as he sought to establish his court career. Men's dress was determined by their rank. It involved fewer layers, an evolving series of jackets, and most importantly, specific hats and decorations. The political necessity of robes for regular appearance at court made a reliable and uninterrupted source of clothing production a vital concern for the Heian male. That was a quote. So when wives provided their husbands with court robes, this was not only a significant form of financial, but also political support. Fujiwara no Michinaga's mother-in-law gave him 2 sets of robes a year, which he used to present himself to the imperial family and aristocracy as the proper and powerful regent. Women contributed to their menfolk's political fortunes, not by merely providing robes, but by curating appropriate robes as a key element of the court practices and performances by which men's careers might advance, stagnate, or end. Court and other elite women did not weave or otherwise produce cloth, so to assemble appropriate sets of robes for their men as well as themselves, fabrics were first purchased by them or their husbands, after which wives up to the highest ranks of the nobility engaged in dyeing, tailoring, decorating and designing. These were highly skilled as well as laborious tasks and entailed transmission of the complex knowledge of colour combinations and the practical techniques to produce them. Women's textile expertise was recognised in a description of the perfect wife as having dyeing expertise comparable to one princess and needlework skills matching another. The significance of this role may be seen when one woman denied her textile skills and resources to her husband, using her specifically female expertise as leverage to try to reduce his extramarital affairs. These roles were significant delineators of the class of hyper-elite women, and since the clothing system was what, quote, made the aristocracy aristocratic, transmitted political legitimacy, and enunciated hierarchical authority, unquote, it is no exaggeration to say that women in their role as curators of dress were woven deeply into the political fabric of the court as fundamental to the everyday and ongoing functioning of Heian rule. But they were not supposed to say so. Women seem to have cultivated the appearance of being selflessly uninvolved in court politics, allowing their menfolk to act on their behalf and at most offering them assistance. In reality, they stood at the centre, not only through their mastery of textiles, but also as mothers of emperors, regents, and officials to whom accrued the wealth and rank that completed the reproduction of the Heian court system. The fortunes of Michinaga and other men of the Fujiwara clan rested upon their wives producing daughters eligible to marry imperial princes. When such a daughter as the Empress Shoshi gave birth to princes, not only did she secure her own position as the mother of future emperors, but also that of her father Michinaga. He joined senior Fujiwara men, past and future, who became grandfathers and sometimes regents of young emperors. Empresses raised their boys in their grandfathers' households, allowing these senior men to maintain their political influence. Court aristocrats, having dressed in the astonishing garments that marked their status, were then largely concealed from view through practices that, according to Rebecca Hunter, mark rank by the ability to control visibility. At the ceremony for enthroning a new emperor, 18 ladies used large fans to conceal their master while he moved before the assembled nobility to take his seat behind a curtain, after which 2 ladies raised just one side of the drape. A painting, which unfortunately I have not been able to find a reproduction of, a painting of Empress Shoshi shows the viewer only the hems of her robes behind decorated blinds as she watches women planting rice while wearing broad-brimmed hats that keep off the rain and also partly conceal the planters' faces. The foreman is protected and partly concealed by an umbrella and watches the women, who themselves focus on their work. Almost nobody in the picture is looking at Shoshi. The picture illustrates the complex interplay of status and gender in producing different degrees of visibility. An important mark of status was to have others do the work of concealment for you, which required and demonstrated the wealth to maintain a suitable retinue. Hunter points out that the goal was not to become invisible, but to draw attention to what was not seen, to reinforce the mystery and awe of exalted status, and to demonstrate that status by remaining what she calls visibly hidden from view. Aristocrats, both male and female, could and did have sexual relations and produce children with people other than their spouses, before or after marriage, with very few restrictions, and such liaisons are a central concern of Heian literature. But how did they meet? Outside, aristocrats of both sexes travelled in curtained ox carts, as we see in this picture, and to move to and from the carts, women wore wide-brimmed hats and veils to conceal their faces and even their clothing. Ox carts, and of course mansions, advertised the presence of aristocrats, but risked making them entirely invisible, which was disadvantageous both to status maintenance and to courtship and affairs. In order to gain the advantages of being visibly hidden, some glimpses had to be possible, which was achieved by putting out robes, pulling out different layers of clothing and displaying the colour combinations right up to the edge of the base lintel or protruding beneath the carriage screens or curtains. Scent and sound could also pass through the visual barriers. These seductive glimpses were the smallest and most controllable transgressions of the prescribed spatial segregation between unrelated people of opposite sexes. Although it was felt to be somehow wrong for a man to force himself on a woman of the same or higher rank, the sources suggest that, as in most societies, ultimately men had the upper hand physically, socially, and legally. Male and female aristocrats were separated by clothing, screens and walls, but textiles, paper, bamboo and wood, which these things were made of, provided the flimsiest of barriers, which were readily breached not only in private, but also on the most ceremonial of occasions, like the birth of an imperial prince. Women were judged by double standards, and scholars have described manipulation, coercion, rape, and victim blaming as routine and accepted behaviour for male Heian court aristocrats. Rapists were unlikely to feel they had done wrong because women were trapped by two conventions, one that, regardless of their actual wishes, required them to show sexual reluctance on pain of their reputation, and another that expected their submission in sexual contexts. In order to convey that no really did mean no, a woman's only chance was to show her invulnerability by expressing refusal that was definitive and unrelenting, necessitating multiple harsh rebuffs of men who, denied passive acceptance of their desires, readily became demanding and aggressive. Fighting back is rare in our sources, and when one jealous wife throws hot ashes on her husband, she is labelled as mentally unstable. Women were largely held responsible not only for their own sexuality, but also for keeping that of men in check. According to Setsuar tales, it was women's responsibility to deny men opportunities to rape them, and victims could be blamed for not protecting themselves sufficiently. Indeed, from the 12th century onwards, a woman could be jailed for inviting an attempted rape by walking alone at night. While such views were, and remain, familiar in many places, this example may represent an extreme of institutionalization of the double standard. Through the threads and fabrics of textiles and the individual bodies they dressed, Heian court women were, simultaneously and unsurprisingly, of fundamental importance to the fortunes of their families in all senses, central to the highest of political activities and controlled by social policing and the threat or reality of sexual violence. While I'm not discussing diachronic change today, my analysis here may point to ways in which we might reframe some of the changes of the 13th and 14th centuries in the archipelago, when it might appear that networks created and maintained to a significant degree through the deployment of clothing became less central to court life and the politics that occurred there, and women's roles in political life diminished. If we turn then to the mainland, as at the Heian court, Song officials and the imperial family wore highly regulated clothing in silk, with not only colours specified, but also decorations in great detail. The emperor's many outfits used mostly gauzes in shades of red, yellow and blue, though the most ceremonial version that we see here was predominantly black. The women dressed in line with their husband's rank. So for the most formal occasions, the empress dressed entirely in blue, a gauze inner robe, a loose outer robe with 5 colours of mystical bird, and with a red patterned border to the sleeves and around the opening from hem to hem, a knee cover with jade hangings, socks, shoes with gold decoration, and a crown bearing 9 silk flowers and 4 feng-huang phoenixes. Officials' courtwear was styled as less elaborate versions of imperial dress. Texts describe a basic outfit of trousers, silk twill chemise, a loose polychrome robe under a belted outer robe, and a hat of lacquered plain gauze over a woven rattan frame with flaps stiffened with an iron wire. These men wore primarily red and black for the most important ceremonies, and what was called public dress by rank of purple, red, green, and, until 1078, black. Finer gradations of status were denoted by decoration according to a complex code, for instance, different motifs and progressively fewer symbols and strings of jade beads or ridges on the hat. Judges and censors wore distinctive blue sashes with brocaded lotus designs. Written accounts are confirmed by the Zhejiang tomb of Zhou Yu, an Imperial University student who was awaiting an official appointment when he died at the age of 27, probably in 1249. He was buried with more than 30 stomach covers, chemises, shirts, trousers, jackets, skirts, padded knee covers and robes, a lacquered silk hat, and shoes in 6 types of silk. About 40% were the gauzes we would expect, but featuring geometric or floral motifs that are far more complex than the texts suggest, an indication of the wealth accumulated even at the lowest levels of the Shidafu official class. To display this wealth, officials persistently dressed above their rank, reflecting the failure of the Song government to enforce a procession of sumptuary rulings. Numerous edicts tried to limit the use of gold decorations to imperial use, and also of certain textile patterns, colours or designs, by banning both the possession and commercial production of these items. For instance, in 1036 and 1049, the court claimed exclusive use of red or crimson gauzes to cover food boxes, and in the late 12th century, this extended to yellow. Throughout the 12th century, typical penalties of 2 or 3 years jail, or sometimes 100 blows of the cane, did not prevent the making or using of red or yellow clothes, or gauze fans, of sun, moon, star or dragon motifs on clothing or carriages, or of densely woven patterned silk, all of which were supposed to be restricted to the highest levels. There is no evidence of effective enforcement. It seems particularly quixotic that the court specifically wished to stop officials in their own homes from making banners with silk gauze, a material that the textual and archaeological evidence shows they already used for almost everything else. Varied elements of foreign dress also called down edicts on women in particular, in the capital or further afield, typically giving them a month to dispose of the offending articles. The selection of items seems more or less arbitrary. In 1025, it was wools, an imported material, in white, brown or light brown, forbidden for anything except riding capes. In 1048, it was clothing and saddles, and especially items in copper green. In 1049, it was tall headdresses with dangling scarves that had been popularised by palace women, but which a censor condemned as heterodox. Whatever next? While women of the wealthier classes wore bright colours like red or purple at will, officials were restricted to purple, white or black, even at home. Purple had been particularly contentious. Restricted to the nobility by the 7th century Tang emperors, a century of exemptions for special circumstances and military men created a confusing proliferation of purple wearers at court that withstood repeated attempts at clarification. By the late 10th century, those not entitled to wear purple were using a very dark shade to pass as black at home, which the government attempted to prevent for nearly 15 years before conceding defeat in 995. Nevertheless, efforts to straighten out who could wear purple at court continued into the 12th century. For the Song, we can see further down the social scale, with evidence, for instance, that commoners had to stick to undyed cloth until 982, when a policy advisor asked that they be allowed to wear black. And we can also see that they added colour where they could, although they were specifically forbidden from using the blue silk umbrellas that were one mark of an official. An unknown man, probably a trader, buried in Hunan in the late 11th century, was accompanied by 200 silk fragments, a quilt, a hat, 4 pairs of shoes, and 16 expensive garments in plain and figured weaves, including simple and complex gauzes with geometric and peony designs, and mostly dyed black, brown, orange, or yellow. So much for the sumptuary laws. Where Heian courtiers seem to have been largely self-policing, in terms of the clothing regulations, Song people of all social classes simply ignored theirs. Textiles and clothing featured notably as dowry for all with enough property to be marriageable. In contrast to Heian attitudes and practices that valorized male promiscuity and took a very informal approach to marriage, the orthodox Song system of a formal limit of one legal wife plus concubinage endorsed elite men's accumulation of multiple women under a veneer of technical monogamy that had the same effect of sanctioning the wealthy and powerful to satisfy stereotypical urges for sex and status displays. Textiles played mediating roles that helped to sustain this system, and, as among the Heian aristocracy, the close association of clothing and fabrics with the female world could also place considerable wealth in the hands of individual women. Control of their own property allowed such women, and especially widows, much more freedom of action than we might expect. Marital gift exchanges included, where affordable, raw silk tabbies or gauzes, textiles showing off the bride's skill in embroidery and weaving, clothing and headdresses for the couple, and the marriage was solemnized with a length of silk draped over the couple's hands as they sat on a curtained bed. In the days after the wedding, further silks were exchanged in ceremonies that could last a month. The bride herself arrived with a trousseau of textiles, including silk lengths and clothing, enough for a lifetime if the family could afford it, of which a good proportion had been made by the woman herself. Such property showed that the woman was being sent as a proper wife and not as a concubine, and was described as personal and private. A wife's dowry was not transferred to her husband or his family, and she continued to control it throughout her marriage and beyond. Dowry, the term, was in fact the entirety of a woman's personal property, intended to support a woman and prevent her from falling into servile status. A woman's dowry would eventually pass to her children of both sexes, who were meant to use it for filial sacrifices. The clothing was usually passed down to the woman's daughters, along with jewellery, but unlike jewellery, clothing was rarely sold. Given the high value of silk garments, this in itself constituted a significant flow of wealth down the female line. Through at least the 13th century, textiles were much more valuable compared to land than in later times, as were jewellery, cash, and other movables. Dowries or parts of dowries, often predominantly comprised of cloth or clothing, were enough to set up a shop in the 12th century, or to contribute to buying a piece of real property. Women of the Song property classes were likely to possess significant personal wealth, which could attract covetous affines. Much of our evidence for women's property rights comes from accounts of court cases where judges frequently found in favour of women defending themselves against such relatives. The women in court over property cases were disproportionately widows and divorcees, who would usually be expected to return to their natal families in full possession of their individual property, with which they could, as adults, contract themselves another marriage. Men appear not to have disdained becoming a second husband when a good dowry was in prospect, but marital families were sometimes loath to lose at least potential access to this wealth. On the other hand, a widow, provided that she did not remarry, received her husband's inheritance to manage as she wished, as representative and household head of his descent line. The expectation was that she would transfer the property to a biological or adopted heir who could maintain the filial offerings. We have considered marriage thus far as a technology largely directed towards accumulating property and status by providing heirs and sexual partners, primarily for the benefit of patriarchs, while noting significant and somewhat unexpected subversions, notably in favour of Song women of property. However, from around the 11th century, marriage began to be reformulated by Song literati as primarily a moral technology, which still worked towards the old goals, but now subordinated these to the rhetorical and increasingly the practical aim of ordering the world according to the new ideas of Daoxue and Neo-Confucianism, one family node at a time. In relation to marriage, the ostensible goal was the perennial desire to control female sexuality, as manifested in daughters, wives/daughters-in-law, mothers, and especially widows, whose relative independence was fostered by their property rights. The Dowry goals were ideological and moral, although in practice the disposition of property was rarely far beneath the surface. Dowry ideas endowed women with weighty responsibilities for sustaining the social connections on which political order was held to be based. Where men were enjoined to maintain undying loyalty to the dynasty, the parallel for women was to maintain undying loyalty to their husband, including in widowhood. A Shadafu elite woman was to relieve her menfolk of responsibility for household and financial matters so that they could concentrate on education, self-cultivation, and the labours of office. Wives' duties thus involved significant control of money and property, as they managed everything from arranging marriages and hiring workers, through buying and selling land and collecting dues owed, to dispensing community relief. But in the Dowry ideal, a woman should not be doing this with her own property, but only for the benefit of her husband and his children. Exemplary stories peddled by Dowry literati encourage women to surrender their finances to the patriline, but women were not compelled to do so until the Mongols conquered the Song. By 1303, UN literati officials, after 3 decades of dialectical exchange with Mongol emperors and advisors, had progressively dispossessed women of both the conquered and the conquering groups, first of their choice in remarriage and then of their property rights as well. The result was the convergence of 2 systems of patriarchy into a single fabric of social, moral, sexual, and economic control. So, to come to some concluding thoughts. Among the many things left out of this paper, I have not had time to discuss here how silk, the common feature of elite clothing, was acquired through networks of merchants and produced by the embodied labour of largely unpaid women and paid artisans, each of whom may be seen as a node, some threaded to various others for marketing, taxation and distribution, and some that remained more localised and social in extent, such as a woman's production of her own trousseau. Truly, silk was a substrate that wove its way into a remarkable range of activities and imperatives. What I have discussed is behaviours best or only recorded for 2 distinctive and fantastically wealthy elites. For both of them, status was achieved, manifested and defended through networks that threaded together female relationships mediated through textiles, which overlapped with family networks that also involved men. Through this technology of the body, just one of several, we may see how women of the hyper-elite Heian aristocracy and of the propertied Song Shadafu class played indispensable roles in further crucial substrates formed by the reproduction and support of families and the creation and sustenance of moral orders, and in the networks comprising high politics. The women did things that their menfolk could not do, not only bearing children, but applying a range of sometimes extraordinary textile skills marked as female for the benefit of their husbands or family, creating space in which men could pursue political or moral achievement and often supporting their families financially. Heian hyper-elite men and the Song Yuan Daoxue officials found different routes to control the performance of these tasks by individual embodied women, coercing them into subordination through social policing, sexual violence, and denial of legal rights. Whereas both societies were bound by a shared substrate of the use, valorization, and regulation of silk clothing, the significance of that valorization and the effectiveness of the regulation were governed by distinct networks. At the Heian court, these were tissues of regulation These were tissues of socio-political relationships that were apparently highly effective in terms of self-policing among the relevant group. By contrast, the institutionalized socio-bureaucratic networks of the Song government issued politico-moral pronouncements, that had little impact on its target groups at any level of Song society. The patterns of these and other networks shifted in both regions during the 13th and 14th centuries to reduce the significance of women in politics and their independence in economic life, respectively. In the archipelago, the manipulation of silk clothing appears to become less central to politics as power shifted to a more militarized basis and a new physical location in which networks of relationships among military men, very mobile military men, became the locus of political authority under the military government of the Kamakura Bakufu, based at the new capital in the Kanto Plain. Technologies of political power shifted from textiles to soldiers and weapons, from silk to steel. On the mainland, most visibly in the Yangtze Valley, but with cross-cultural effects on all the diverse women of the Yuan realm, moral economic concerns produced legislation that proved to be enforceable through civil litigation in a way that criminal penalties for sumptuary infractions had not been. The UN became simultaneously more military in the shape of the conquest elite and more moralistic as the continuing literati elite embraced and sought to enforce Daxue ideals. Clothing regulations remained in place, but were to a significant degree displaced, or at least offset, by the Mongol rulers' regular distributions of astonishing quantities of silk and gold clothing to large numbers of leading figures, including officials. Acts of political theatre that rewove political networks into an almost, but not quite, completely different fabric. How we see these cases in a global frame depends on which scale we adopt, and it's always more illuminating if we can explore how the different levels interact. We can, of course, see a further substrate here of patriarchy finding specific forms among different groups, but we cannot describe these as societies in any meaningful way. The Heian court aristocracy lived in a secluded, even claustrophobic world of opulence and leisure, power and danger, utterly alien to the great mass of commoners, and even distinct from the lives of regional and other lesser aristocrats. The mainland Shodafu class of the 10th to 14th centuries was merely elite rather than hyper-elite, and some of the men found ways of imposing their socio-moral vision on a group of specifically propertied women, even as swathes of wider society continued to ignore other strictures such as the sumptuary laws. What a layered approach offers us is greater clarity about the lack of correspondence between the extent of different aspects of historical activity and where those divergencies are located. While historians are naturally drawn to the rich source material excerpted here, and which I have accessed through other people's research, it is always important not to be seduced into letting a part, and such extraordinary parts, stand for the whole. And this is particularly so when thinking globally. This kind of global history approach keeps us focused on the importance of considering particular topics and selected cases rather than generalizations, even or especially when working on a global scale. But it also shows the value of delineating as precisely as possible not only the historical specificities of the evidence, but also the categories we choose to adopt. One would always hope for new questions to arise from fresh analyses of the sources, but it is when we stop taking our concepts for granted that we are forced to decide what we really want to talk about and to give more acknowledgement to our own presence in our work. In our increasingly partisan and unreflective age, this approach to history is one way of keeping us honest. Thank you.